Maria, is it okay? So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the new year, and welcome to the new timings and new, I would say, the teaching sessions for this year. This was on public demand that we had to change the timings and, of course, the frequency. I think we'll again see for a few months how this goes in this timing, and we're always open to make adjustments, which is going to be convenient for most of the people. So welcome to these online teaching sessions, and we had a couple of weeks of break for New Year and kind of starting the new academic session for this year. And thank you very much, Apollo Chennai and Ramya, for coordinating and moderating for today's session. And thank you also for getting your esteemed experts from today. I see Dr. Sharanya after a long time, and good evening, Dr. Sharanya. And Dr. Sharanya is the director of Jeevan. How are you, ma'am? Is director of the Jeevan Cord Blood Bank, and we have been associated with her for many years now. So thank you very much for getting the time out to participate in this today's session. Dr. Indra Jayakumar, who is a senior consultant at Apollo Chennai, and she's going to give her inputs as well. And we have, our own Dr. Revati Raj, ma'am. She doesn't need introduction to this audience. Dr. Ramya and Dr. Venkateshwaran from Apollo Chennai. And Dr. Ramesh is going to be doing the case presentations today. So I hope you all had a good New Year. Work is picking up slowly, and hence this time change and the new pattern to these online teaching sessions. So we're starting this year's academic session with a very important and a common, I would say, topic which is very relevant in practice in the transplant settings, and that is how to collect the hematopoietic stem cells. Because at the end of the day, a good collection, a good stem cell dose, a good quality stem cell, is what is required for a successful transplant. And we thank Ramya putting this all session together, and she's going to be moderating today's session. And as usual, we'll have a didactic session to begin with, and then we'll have some case-based presentations and discussions based on that. I request everyone, please keep your screen, videos on, and feel free to ask questions on the chat box or raise your hand so that you can ask the question to the experts. Over to you, Dr. Ramya.
Thank you, sir, and Happy New Year and Happy Pongal, Happy Sankranti, Happy Lori, Happy Bihu to everyone who's joined. And I will let ma'am, Dr. Revati, to please start the session, please, and we'll take it further after her didactic. Ma'am, over to you, please.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so thank you for giving us the opportunity to do the first session of the year. And in Tamil, we have a saying called Thai Pirandal Vari Pirakkum. So it's a new beginning to the year, and Pongal is a very important festival for us, and everything new begins with the harvest festival. And it's very poetic that we are talking about harvesting stem cells on this particular day. And I'm really grateful for my team, Ramya, Ramesh, and Venkatesh, for having put this together, and for the two lovely ladies, Indra, our PICU consultant, and Sharanya from Jeevan Stem Cell Bank, for having joined us today. We'll try and stick to timing, and we have quiz in between. So we really want all of the participants to answer the quiz. How we are going to do the flow of sessions today, I will just spend 15 minutes on what we need to know, the very basics of collection and processing of stem cells. Then there is a saying in American billiards, I don't think any of us play this, but what we need to know is we have to put the ball into the little pouch, but we can't touch the ball number 8. So if our ball is stuck behind ball number 8, we are in a very difficult position because we won't be able to win the situation. So these are difficult positions. So we've chosen 8 difficult scenarios, and we've interspersed the quiz in between. So please feel free to participate so that we make it as interactive as possible. I'll begin by giving you a little overview on stem cells. When we do medicine, people say that the stem cells are the most important cells, and they are the immortal nectar of life, and everything can be cured using stem cells. And just few things that we need to know about stem cells. And the most important thing is that they are capable of self-renewal, and they're able to grow and repair and renew tissue. So these are the two main characteristics. They're capable of self-renewal and differentiation. So these are the two main characteristics of stem cells. We have two types of stem cells in our body: embryonic stem cells, which come from fusion of the egg and the sperm, and they are totipotential, which means they can give rise to all cells of the body. And each organ has its own pluripotential stem cells. So you have the cardiac stem cell, the hematopoietic stem cell, the neural stem cells. They give rise to different cells of that particular organ. So there is always a confusion about cord blood, because people feel that they are embryonic because they come from the fetus, but cord blood is actually hematopoietic stem cells of the fetus, and they don't have any embryonic potential. They are not totipotential, they are pluripotential. So stem cell research was a big thing when in the 90s and early 2000, and we could make any cell line on a petri dish from embryonic stem cells. But after a lot of ethical consideration, embryonic stem cell research was shelved, especially after Bush administration came, because there was not much money for research, because technically we are killing a life to make one cell line, but it had great potential. So adult stem cell, we said we have neural stem cells, which give rise to neurons, astrocytes, and oligodendrocytes, cardiac stem cells, and for different parts of the body. Now, what is a magic in the lab is induced pluripotential stem cells. So what we couldn't do with the embryonic stem cell, we are now able to just culture skin fibroblasts, take it, alter its genetic potential in such a way that it has the self-renewal property. And these are called IPS, or induced pluripotential stem cell, which in the future, this is going to be where we test out new drugs, and there'll be a lot of interesting things. We can have disease models. So a lot of things are happening in the lab in research areas using induced pluripotential stem cells. So basically you have embryonic stem cells, adult stem cells, and induced pluripotential stem cells, which are the three types we need to know. We only deal with hematopoietic stem cells, and this is the one organ transplant which has little or no implication for the donor, because these are things that the donor makes up within the next few days of donation, whereas kidney or liver or any other organ transplant, they are going to have to donate a part of their organ. So hematopoietic stem cells are giving rise to myeloid lymphoid progenitor, and they sit in a nice bed of spongy stroma, which provides the nourishment. If the stem cells are given to a different person, it's allogenic. To the same person, it's autologous. And the stem cells can come from, we can harvest the cells. So these are seeds. We can harvest them from the marrow, from peripheral blood, or from umbilical cord blood. And just over the next few minutes, I'll just go through what are the differences in harvesting from bone marrow, from PBSC, and from cord. So this antigen called CXCR4 is very important protein which anchors the stem cells, keeps it in the little pockets inside the marrow. So if CXCR4 is not there, the stem cells aren't anchored to the marrow and they are released into the blood circulation. This is something important that we need to remember because it has clinical implications. Stroma is very important because it secretes GCSF, thrombopoietin, and all other cytokines required for the stem cells to grow. This is an important slide. It tells us, the pink line tells us how many lymphocytes are there in each of these, and the blue one, how many stem cells. So you can see bone marrow has an ideal balance of lymphocytes and stem cells. So the blue line is the number of stem cells. If you look at cord blood, it has 1 log lower. So if you say that there are 10 million cells in bone marrow, there are it'll be 1 log lower in cord blood. So the number of stem cells is lower. Peripheral blood stem cells have much higher, 3-4 times the amount of stem cells, but the number of lymphocytes is very high. This is important because we need minimum number of lymphocytes for engraftment. Lower lymphocytes means there's a risk of rejection, but the higher number of donor lymphocytes also predisposes the patient or recipient to graft versus host disease. So we need a good balance between the two components. So engraftment is when neutrophils and platelets are beginning to grow, and these standard definitions are there in all textbooks. And this is important because because of the number of stem cells, once we give bone marrow, the new cell engraftment happens between about 14 to 21 days, in PBSC 10 to 14 days, and in cord blood round about 21 to 28 days, because it has 1 log lower number of stem cells. And this is important in clinical practice. How many stem cells we need, it all depends on the recipient's body weight. If it's your own stem cells, if it's an autograft, we can get by with 2 into 10 power 6. CD34 tells us the number of stem cells. Whereas if it is to a different person, we need at least 3 to 5 into 10 power 6 per kg of CD34. And if we don't have them, then we can have poor graft function and late graft failure. So this is important. And if we need to process the stem cells, if there's ABO incompatibility or any processing required, then we need more number of stem cells because there can be cell loss. So we now come to the process of harvesting. So when we plan a harvest, first we decide, are we going to do PBSC, bone marrow or cord? And it all depends on who is the patient, who is the donor. So, and also what is the patient's underlying condition. For example, if they have a condition like osteopetrosis, where graft rejection rate is going to be high, certainly I won't use cord, because cord has very low number of stem cells and T lymphocytes. If I have a high chance of getting graft versus host disease, a benign condition, I would prefer to use bone marrow. If the donor is an infant donor, so then I would prefer to use bone marrow. So everything depends on what is the patient's condition and the donor status. For donors, we always give them 2 weeks before the donation, we do deworming, replace vitamin D and B12. B12 deficiency is far more common in our country than we think. And we really need to replace these two, because otherwise they turn out to be poor mobilizers. If the donor needs blood because they're too tiny and they're giving for an older sibling, the blood that we give them has to be irradiated, because it's going to go in an immunocompromised patient. So look at the blood group incompatibility between the patient and donor as well. If we go on to bone marrow harvesting, first thing is that we need to get all our equipment ready. Remember that this is a very traumatic day for the family, because the patient is undergoing a transplant, the donor is someone precious. They really don't want to be in hospital, and they don't know why they should sacrifice for their sibling. They don't feel very generous most of the time. They're forced into doing this. So they need to be made special, and they have to have team 1 and team 2 to look after patient and donor. So we have bone marrow harvest needles, and they're 11 gauge or 13 gauge depending on the size and weight of the donor. We get good syringes, a spike set, 3-way, acid citrate dextrose, because as we aspirate the bone marrow, it shouldn't clot. We have blood bags and blood filter. The Baxter company used to do kits for bone marrow harvest, but we no longer use them because the kits are expensive and not available easily as well. They're about 15,000 rupees. So how much should we take of the marrow? We calculate roughly we need 10 ml per kg of the recipient's body weight to get enough number of stem cells. If there is red cell incompatibility, we'll collect extra. If you're going to cryopreserve, as I said, we have to collect extra. But the dictum is we can never collect more than 20 ml per kg of the donor body weight at one sitting, because it will be too much of loss for the donor. Some patients might, some families may prefer that the donor should not get blood from other people. So we encourage them to have autologous pre-deposit. Sometimes we give iron replacement, and some units also give GCSF before bone marrow harvesting to increase the yield. So this is the equipment in theater. We have the blood bag, we have ACD, we have all the needles set ready on the tray. We have at least 4 needles and each of them are heparinized so that it doesn't clot. And this heparin we use for harvesting is the 1 in 25,000 heparin, not the 1 in 5,000 which we use for hep flush. So the harvest needles are the smaller type as shown here or the longer ones if it's a heavier donor. The positioning has to be correct. The donor is placed in a prone position under full anesthesia, and from both the iliac crest, we do the harvest with only gentle movement at the wrist and no movement at the shoulder level. Because remember, these disposable needles are very, very sharp, and we need to take the harvest in the bone marrow in very, very small aliquots, because if you take more, you'll only get red cells and you won't have enough marrow. So in small aliquots of 3 to 5 ml, and we keep adding it to the bag that has 1:7 ACD. So there's one person for the bag and they have to keep shaking the bag gently so that the marrow doesn't clot. So each of the syringes are heparinized and the bag is also anticoagulated with ACD. So for example, if I need 7 ml of marrow, I add 1 ml of ACD and keep it ready. Once we finish collecting the amount we need, we have to filter all the bone particles and the fat particles in the marrow, and then it's ready for infusion. We have to transport it in a special transport box and keep it at 4 to 8 degrees until we get the CD34 report. The donor, the marrow site has to be examined. We try to use only 2 skin holes on each side and try to move the skin hole and do different sites on the marrow so that the parents don't feel bad that so many times the child has been poked. So it just looks aesthetically better. There is an equipment available called the marrow miner equipment. We don't have in India. It would make life so much easier because this equipment, there's only one skin entry, bone entry, and the needle goes in and it will travel to different parts of the iliac crest and collect marrow cells and come out under one puncture. So it's like a little drilling equipment which we use for doing deep bore wells. So if this does come here, it would be good. I think it is available in India, but we still haven't used it. So that's regarding bone marrow harvest. And you'll think, how do little children cope? They actually cope very well. Peripheral blood stem cells, this is becoming more and more fashionable because it's an outpatient procedure in adults, but in children, again, we have to be careful when the donor is a child. We give 5 days of GCSF injection so that some of the stem cells come into the peripheral blood, and the apheresis machine separates the cells based on the specific gravity. There's clear plasma on top, red cells at the bottom, and the mononuclear cells, which are heavier stem cells, are there in between. So we have different types of machine. The old one was the Cobe Spectra, but we have the more modern ones. So there's one line to remove the blood and other one to process the blood and return the components that we don't need back to the donor. A lot of the unrelated donors are moving towards PBSC because it makes their life easier. So we have to keep in mind PBSC donations are predominantly voluntary, are predominantly PBSC, but we could ask for marrow as well. There are other ways of mobilizing peripheral blood. We can do at the back of chemotherapy like cyclophosphamide, and there is also a new drug, plerixafor, which is available, which will come in one of the cases, so I will not talk too much about it. The third component is cord blood stem cells. So when the baby is born, the cord is clamped and cut. We are not denying the baby of any of its blood volume, and the baby is removed from the scene. The placenta is still in utero. We cannulate the umbilical vessel and under gravity, let the blood run into the blood bag, a normal blood bag that we use. So this is transported to the cord blood bank and it's centrifuged. Only the mononuclear cells are collected and cryopreserved. So the cryoprotectant is called DMSO. Once it gets into the cell, it will suspend it in whichever cell cycle it is. The cells are kept alive. But once the cryoprotectant goes into the cell, it has to be cooled very, very slowly. Rapid cooling will cause cell death. So we go -1, -2, -3, like that, down to -180. And the cryopreserved cells are kept in special bags, which can take up extremes of temperature and kept in the -80 or -180 freezers. Just for information, there are two types of cord blood banks. One is a public cord blood bank. Another one is a private cord blood bank. Public cord blood banks don't charge you. They collect the stem cells and keep it for any transplant center to be used. And the standards for public cord blood banks are quite high. And in our country, there are 3 public cord blood banks, Jeevan in Chennai, Reliance in Mumbai, and StemSite in Ahmedabad. Private cord blood banks are what you pay for and keep for yourself. And a lot of them do what is called community banking now. And they say, if someone else needs also, you can use it within that community. But this is not something that we are encouraging. And I request all of you to read the IAP guidelines on cord blood banking. Infusion is the easiest part. You connect the stem cells to a central line, and sometimes we do pre-medicate them with paracetamol and Avel and hydrocortisone if there is ABO incompatibility. Just for our information, if there is mismatched stem cells or half-matched stem cells, there are processes that we can do to select just the stem cells. You don't want the T lymphocytes, you don't want the B lymphocytes. So there are magnetic beads which have antibodies against CD19, and all the CD19 cells that pass through this magnetic column get sucked out and pure stem cells come out. So T cells and CD19 positive B lymphocytes can be taken out, and this process, we now call it TCR alpha beta depletion. So the other way to deplete, to use half-matched stem cells is post-transplant cyclophosphamide. So this is also one of the methods. This is an important concept. How much CD34? What is its viability? Viability tells you that these cells are still capable of self-renewal. If the numbers are there, they're not viable, it's a big problem. And any good processing facility, they should have at least more than 90% viability. If it is less than that, that means the whole processing hasn't been good. And viability goes down if we do any stem cell processing, plasma reduction, red cell reduction, thawing, washing, or store it for more than 72 hours. This is an important concept. If there is blood group incompatibility between the donor and the recipient, it can be minor or major. There are tables available. I request all of you to look up. But O group red cells are okay for everyone, and AB plasma is okay for everyone. But major incompatibility is if there is red cell incompatibility, and minor incompatibility is if there is plasma incompatibility. And based on that, we have to remove the red cells and plasma from the stem cell component. And during transplant, there's phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Phase 1 is when the child is going through conditioning, you give their own blood group. Phase 2 is when they have a mixture of the donors and their recipient cells. So that time we have to be careful what blood products we use for them. And as I said, the dictum usually is O group red cells are okay and AB plasma or platelets are okay. And phase 3 is when they've converted into blood group, then you can support them with the donor group. Red cell reduction, we add a substance called hydroxyethyl starch. All the red cells will settle at the bottom and they can be removed and you have pure stem cells. Thawing is what we just keep the stem cells in a 37-degree water bath for infusion. So what was rock solid is now ready. We really have to thank the donors, as I said, make them feel special at the end of donation, so that all the focus is not just on the patient, but it's also on the donor. They feel special. These are some of the further reading materials about bone marrow harvesting, what's a marrow miner, what are the risks of complications during stem cell collection for PBSC donors. So these are good reading material. So if any of you want to read. So that is the didactic part. I hope it wasn't too fast, but we have a lot to cover within a short span of time. And I'll now hand over back to Ramya to talk about different scenarios where we are behind the 8 ball and what we do to get out of them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. That was really gave us a lot of important.
Do you want me to continue sharing,
or
you want to share?
You could continue if that's okay, please, so that we save time, because we have exactly an hour with us. And if we can finish about a few minutes before that, we could go through the quiz answers as well. So I'll ask Rumesh to please start with the case. Rumesh?
Yes, ma'am. Good evening, everyone. So I'll go with the case scenarios. First case, a 6-month-old boy weighing 6.7 kg. He was diagnosed as having stage 4's neuroblastoma, had a left adrenal primary with liver and bone marrow mets and NMIC amplified. So he received 6 cycles of chemotherapy, and surgical excision of the primary mass was done in the referring hospital. And he was referred to us for high-dose chemotherapy followed by autologous stem cell rescue. So here for stem cell collection, he was given GCSF for 5 days. And on the 5th day, he was, a right subclavian and a right femoral vascular was inserted under short GA. And peripheral bed stem cell harvest was performed in PICU under GA. And the yield of the CD34 cells on day 5 was suboptimal. So the next day, PBSC collection was repeated, and the total CD34 count of both days came to around 3.9 into 10 power 6 cells per kg body weight.
So I'd like Dr. Indra, who is the senior consultant in our PICU, to tell us a little bit about the VASCAT size for pediatric PBSCs and what are the challenges that we face in infants when we do these PBSCs and how do we overcome them?
Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Revati, Ramya, for this opportunity. Challenges, I think every patient that Revati and Ramya give me are very challenging. They keep us on our toes. Just a rough rule of thumb for VASCAT sizes, up to 10 kilo, it is 6.5 French. This is the smallest size of VASCAT available. 10 to 15, you can use 7 French. 15 to 20, we use 8 to 10 French. And above 20 kilo, 10 French or greater. But remember, this is just a rough rule. In borderline cases, we do an ultrasound of the vein and we choose a catheter diameter which is at least 4 millimeters smaller than the vein diameter. In infants, very small infants, we have to use a 4.5 French sheath since the dialysis catheter is not, we do not have that size, small size. Couple of things that we have to keep in mind before we start this procedure. One is you really need expertise to get the VASCAT in because these patients could have low platelets. You don't want them bleeding. You don't want causing thrombosis or rupture, other complications while inserting the VASCAT. Sedation. Challenges sedation during and sedation after inserting the VASCAT, that is during the stem cell collection. Also, it is very important to identify comorbidities. If they have underlying myocardial dysfunction because they've had past chemotherapy, which was cardiotoxic, if they were thalassemics, this is not only for this particular case, this is a general. So if they're thalassemics with iron overload in the heart, so that is something we have to identify. And the team here does an echo before they start the transplant, so which is very good. Airway issues, as always, you have to identify and be prepared before any procedure. Keep your airway equipments, at least a bag mask and an IM adrenaline ready. So what are the complications? So since it is citrated blood, you can have hypocalcemia, and we always give an IV calcium before we start the procedure. If we look at the ECG, and if we see some bradycardia, little prolongation of QT, then we can give a second dose. We do a blood gas in between as well. Hypovolemia, especially in small infants, because a lot of their blood is extracorporeal, that is in the circuit. So they can drop their blood pressures, and also with the sedation that you're giving. So that's something to watch out. We prime the circuit with blood to avoid these complications. Allergy, not very common unless you have propofol allergy. And syncope, if kids are not sedated well enough, if they are alarmed with the procedure, then the syncope is rare. We've not encountered it. So what is the drug we use for insertion of the VASCAP? Generally, we use the combination of ketamine and midazolam. This is a very good combination because ketamine maintains your blood pressure. It increases your sympathetic drive. So it can cause hypertension, and midazolam causes hypo. So this combination actually is very good, maintains the blood pressure. And post-procedure, we have two options: intravenous dexmedetomidine or intravenous propofol infusion. Why do we prefer infusion? Because it maintains a steady state and children are more calmer and they do not need ventilation. The previous slide, please. Thanks. So dexmedetomidine is an alpha-2 agonist like clonidine. Advantage, short half-life, does not cause respiratory depression. Kids do not need to be ventilated when you use this drug, and this is the dose here. And it does not cause hypotension unless you give very high doses or they are hypovolemic. Next. So we prime, as I said, we prime the circuit, we give calcium, we do a blood gas. In infants, like in this particular child, neuroblastoma 6 months, we prefer to intubate and mechanically ventilate because the dose of sedation to keep them very still for this procedure would be very high. So we prefer to intubate, get the VASCAP in, and then continue for 3-4 hours, continue mechanical ventilation for 3-4 hours till the procedure of stem cell collection is done. Thanks. I hope I made myself clear.
Yes, ma'am, that was very, very comprehensive. Thank you. So this is for the for everyone, actually, all of us, that this is a quiz. We'll have all the answers in the end. If people can just put in the chat box, we'll give about 30 seconds, I think. Should be enough. We're going to watch if any of our fellows are going to answer or no. We won't move on till one of them does. Yeah, okay, we got a few answers and I think most of them are right. So I think we can move on. Yeah, Ramesh. So this is another case that Ramesh will present, but a little different. So yeah, go on, please. Yeah, go on.
The second case, she's a 3-year-old girl who was diagnosed with stage 4 neuroblastoma in 2019. Again, she had a left lateral primary with large skull and skull bone mets and bone marrow mets. So this child received 6 cycles of chemotherapy as per ANBL 0532 protocol, and surgical excision of the adrenal mass was done in the referring hospital. And she was planned for a stem cell transplant, but in view of COVID-19 pandemic, she could not travel in time. So she received 2 cycles of mini ice there in that hospital. And when she came to our hospital, she received the GCSF for 5 days. And then the CD34 count on day 3 was, as it was only 4 cells per microliter. So we gave her Mozobil 0.2 mg per kg 10 hours prior to the stem cell collection, after which she had an adequate stem cell collection. So it was around 18.8 into 10 power 6 times CD34 cells per kg.
Thank you, Ramesh. So as he rightly said, both are stage 4 neuroblastoma, both are infants, I mean, in the younger age group, but there was a difference in the way it was collected and the mobilization. So I'll request Dr. Venkatesh to please take us through some of the equipment which is required for PBSC and what is the role of plerixafor in pediatrics.
So thank you, ma'am. Actually, before going to the equipment per se, so actually, ma'am had explained what are the various stages and steps in collecting the PBSC. So first of all, we have to prepare the donor or the patient in case of like autologous stem cell transplantation. So first, all the pre-BMT workup will be done, and in case of like a thalassemia donor, we have to do HP electrophoresis to make sure that they are not whether they are normal or whether they are carrier. And MMC test like mitomycin C is a must in the case of like a family donor for a Fanconi transplant. And as ma'am was telling, vitamin B12 and vitamin D deficiency is highly prevalent in our country. So all the donors will receive 2 weeks prior to the collection. They will receive vitamin B12 and vitamin D. All of them will be dewormed. Then our main thing is for a pediatric donor, we have to make sure that blood has to be arranged for priming the circuit. As Indra ma'am was correctly telling, depending upon the weight of the child, we need a circuit to be primed with blood to prevent hypovolemia and hypotension. And last but not the least, the anesthetic workup and anesthetic checkup has to be done prior to the procedure, because the anesthetist should see the child and assess the vascularity. If needed, Doppler has to be done to look for the patency of the veins for inserting the vas cath. So, and depending upon the weight of the child, as like Dr. Indra ma'am said, like the vas cath size will be decided and it will be secure. And before inserting a vas cath, the child will receive a prophylactic antibiotic dose prior to the procedure. After inserting a vas cath, the children will be taken up for peripheral blood stem cell collection. Here, the two machines which is shown here is like a Cope Spectra and Amicus, that Fresenius Kabi instrument, which is used for the stem cell pheresis. So before pheresis, the proper pheresis, we have to mobilize the stem cell. The mobilization protocol which we usually follow is GCSF based protocol. So here we will use 10 microgram per kg of Nucan, which is the granulocyte colony stimulating factor, for 5 days. 4 days, the child will receive around like the morning of 9 to 10 o'clock. On the 5th day, the child will receive in the early morning, like around 4 o'clock, so that by 6 hours later, where the peak stem cell will be in the peripheral circulation, the collection will be made. So as ma'am was telling, like there is a newer drug called Mosovil, which is the Plerixafor, which is not used frequently in the children. But it is used especially in certain conditions when we found that CD34 count is suboptimal. For example, if it is less than 10, then actually prophylactic Plerixafor is indicated. So in our protocol, usually we'll check the CBC on day 3, CD34 on day 4, and CBC again on day 5 to look for the response for the GCSF. And depending upon the CD34 count, the Mosovil will be given, and usually it will be given 10 to 11 hours prior to the planned collection time. So what is this Plerixafor? So actually the stem cells is attached to the stem cell niche by means of certain receptors. So it is like through the CXCR4, which is present in the stem cell, and SDF, that is stromal derived factor 1, that receptor which is seen in the stromal cells. So these interaction has to be broken down, and Plerixafor is nothing but the CXCR4 inhibitor. Once this connection is broken down, then the stem cells retention by the bone marrow is prevented. Now the stem cells can be freely circulated into the circulation. So this is how it acts. And as it was said previously, the child will receive 4 days of GCSF, and depending upon the CD34 count, we will decide about giving the Plerixafor. The dose is 0.24 milligram per kg. The available strength is 1 vial contains 24 milligrams. So depending upon the weight of the child, the dose will be given 11 hours prior to the collection, and it is given subcutaneous injection, and the collection will be done on the next day. So there are certain factors which prevents mobilization. This is particularly this denotes both for autologous and allogenic, particularly in autologous transplant. For example, in case of neuroblastoma, when the child receives multiple cycles of chemotherapy, especially like ICE or topotecan based chemotherapy, they will be having poor mobilization. And prior radiotherapy, for example, before coming here with the because of this COVID pandemic, 2 or 3 children received radiation prior to the autologous stem cell transplant. So in those conditions, we have to expect there will be poor mobilization. There we have to give empirically that Plerixafor has to be given prior to the collection. And in case of like a prior treatment with purine analogs like fludarabine, melphalan, or lenalidomide also, it can cause poor mobilization.
Thank you, Venkatesh. That was very, very clear. This is the second quiz for everyone. We'll give about 30 seconds, I think, for people to just type in. I think Dr. Revathi already went through this, so it should not be difficult at all. Do you see any answers? I can't. Okay, there are a few answers. Okay, I think we'll move on. We'll give the answers in the end for everyone, so it's good learning for us. Yeah, so now we move on from PBSC collection to a different scenario, which is now you've collected the stem cells. What do you do next? So we have Ramesh, please take us through the third case, please.
Thank you, ma'am. So we had a 3-month-old female infant who was born out of 3rd-degree consanguineous marriage. And in view of recurrent infections, she was suspected to have a primary immune deficiency. And there was history of sibling death as an infant at 5 months of age due to pneumonia. So a genetic testing was done for this baby, and it turned out to be chronic granulomatous disease, NCF2 mutation. And in our unit, when we received her in our unit, she was having an active infection. She had CMV, viremia, she had vulval infection due to candida. She had bilateral extensive consolidation in the lungs. So in view of this, she was planned for an HSCT at the earliest. Donor search was done in the major registries, but we couldn't find a fully matched donor. So the father, who was haploidentical match, was chosen for stem cell collection, and we did a haploidentical stem cell transplant with T-cell alpha beta depletion. The product was cryopreserved in aliquots. In view of active infection, the donor stem cells were actually collected and cryopreserved.
Yeah, I'd now move over to Dr. Sharanya, because with her vast experience of being the director of Jeevan Stem Cell Bank, ma'am, please can you take us through some of the challenges in cryopreservation and how to ensure quality, and what is the difference between the two techniques in which they are cryopreserved? Ma'am, if you could please unmute yourself. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Thank you both. And it's great talking about stem cells after a long time, or being part of a meeting, because I've just actually not been doing anything about cord cells for the last 3 years. And it's something that I've been very sad about. So it's at least good to talk about it today, even if it's in part. Now, when you're asking about the challenges in cryopreservation and how to ensure quality of the final product, I'll take it through both, because we are doing cryopreservation of both the cord cells as well as the PBS, not the PBSC, but it's mainly the cryopreservation of cord cells that we do. But the biggest challenge that we found with cord cells is, I think you need to start with the initial sample volume that you get and the hematocrit. Because if the initial sample volume is not good, you're not going to get any stem cells there to talk about to be cryopreserved at all. And during that process also, you're going to lose a lot. The second thing is that when you have an initial sample hematocrit, especially in cord cells, which are very high, when I say very high, something like more than 50%, you might have a great count, because even if the volume is good and your counts are good, but if your hematocrit is high, you tend to lose a lot of the stem cells during the process of separation. So ideally, if you have a hematocrit of under 30% in your cord blood with a good volume, that's where you get a very good count. So when you start the cryopreservation process, the next challenge we faced was the program that we used for the control rate freezing. Because initially we had a lot of time on our hands, so we did a lot of trials with 3 different CRF programs. One for 1 hour, which is what we started with, and then one that was a shortcut of half an hour, and the third for 2.5 hours, which was finally the best. So with a 2.5 hour protocol, which actually goes through several stages from 0 degrees to minus 21 in the first, at a rate of 0.5 centigrade every minute. And then from 10 degrees on to minus 12, and then from minus 3 to minus 18. And it goes on like that until you reach your minus 180 degrees. So when we used this third protocol of 2.5 hours, that was when we found that our stem cells viability, as well as the CFU count that we finally got in the end on these, was a better product. And even for the CFU count, we did it in using 2 media, both the Methocult and as well as the Milteney media. And we found that, and we had also done it on twin samples, where we did it from 2 cryo segments, identical segments because we had put it into 2 bags. And so we had done it from 2 segments, and we used these 2 segments on each of these media. And uniformly, we found that both the media were fine, either Methocult or Milteney. But we found that we got a lot more cells when we did our CFU, when we used the 2.5 hour protocol, almost 3 times the number as what we got when we used the 1 hour protocol. So we finally had fine-tuned it, and we found that, yes, we needed to stick to the 2.5 hour protocol and use a cryo segment and not a vial of stem cells or anything else to check out on the CFU count. So that was one thing that we did. And again, to further improve the quality of cryopreservation, both the DMSO that was added during cryopreservation had to be at the most about 10%, which meant that we were adding 50% DMSO, about 6 ml, to the 24 ml final product. And if this was added slowly on rotating equipment that we did have to ensure it was added slowly as well as with constant movement, we found that the final product was far better. So these were small things that we did learn over a period of time, which we introduced, and we did it. And as far as the peripheral blood stem cells have been concerned, most of the time we didn't get involved with the cryopreservation at all. We had to give the product fresh soon after collection. But in the early days, we did do cryopreservation of PBSCs for some of the hematologists in Chennai, and we were actually storing it for them. So even there, for those adult stem cells that we cryopreserve, the 1R protocol was fine. If it was for long-term storage, when I say long-term, I mean more than 6 months. If it was just at minus 80 degrees also, we used the 1R protocol only for either of these. And at minus 80 degrees, the maximum we found it was useful was only 6 months, nothing more than 6 months. So if they were going to use it, like if there was a depot being stored for a future transplant, if they were planning to do it 3 months or 4 months later, then some of them wanted us to store it at minus 80, which was fine. But if they said that they didn't know when they were going to use it, then straight away it went into long-term storage at minus 196. So that's how we worked it out. And there was one particular clinician I know, he took us, he actually surprised us, because he wanted it to be dumped into minus 80 without control rate freezing. And he claimed he had very good results, adding an equal volume of 50%, equal volume of DMSO, which meant that the final concentration was 50% in the product. And in fact, we were surprised and we told him, but he said, no, it's fine. I've had very good results. He got rid of all the, he took adequate care to ensure that the side effects of DMSO were taken care of in his patient.
Sure, ma'am. Sure.
So that was it.
Yeah.
So
thank you, ma'am. Sorry. Thank you for sharing your experience. That was, you talk from experience, ma'am. If you could move to the next slide, please. So you talk from experience, so that's very, very, useful for everyone to hear. Just for all the fellows and all the PGs and everyone who's attending, what ma'am was talking about was about cryopreserving. You do it either through controlled rate freezing or through uncontrolled rate freezing. And what we really as clinicians need to know is about this particular chemical called DMSO, dimethyl sulfoxide, what she mentioned, which is used in cryopreservation. It's a safe, it's non-stem cell toxic, and the concentration should be about 10% in the with the normal saline. And it does have clinical side effect profile, which we will come to in the next slides, please. This is the liquid nitrogen vats that ma'am was talking about. Dr. Sharanya was just telling us about how they are frozen and they are cryopreserved in these. We'll just do the quiz for about 30 seconds and then move on to what happened to the previous child with the cryopreserved stem cells. Okay, that's nice. Okay, I think we can move on. So yeah, Rumesh.
Yeah, so case number 4, the same baby as in case number 3, the 3-month-old infant with chronic Gallimimus disease. So she received conditioning therapy with flu, trio, thiatipan, ATG, and the stem cell infusion was done. While on stem cell infusion, she developed hypertension.
So now we were just talking about DMSO, and ma'am told us very lucidly about how the cryopreservation is done. I'd request Dr. Indra to take us through the side effects of DMSO, what we do during, what specific protocol does our PICU follow during infusion of these cryopreserved stem cells. Just before that, like Revati ma'am already told us, the cryopreserved stem cells are thawed, they are washed so that you remove as much DMSO as possible and then you infuse into the child. Indra ma'am, over to you, please.
Thank you, Ramya. So the most important thing is for the PICU and HemOnc team to work together. So they have to actually have a telepathic communication. So, Dr. Revathi and Ramya communicate with the PICU team always whenever there is a cord infusion. And we have learned with experience in the 4 years ago, when the cord cells were not washed, we had very bad hypertension, and pretty alarming because these patients also have low platelets and they used to clutch their head. So we have learned, we have fine-tuned our management. So hypertension does occur, but it is more manageable. So how do we do? First, anticipate complications when giving DMSO. So what are the complications? One is hypertension. Allergic reactions, very rare, but we still keep our IM adrenaline ready. We keep our airway equipment, bag mask also ready. We had one patient with renal toxicity. So that's something to watch out also, and look for the urine color. We do not place an arc line, even though we anticipate hypertension. So we start an SNP infusion. It is already loaded, connected. Remember, you have to cover the SNP tubings when you're giving SNP infusion. So because it's photosensitive. And we start with a 1 ml per hour, which gives about 1 mic per kilo per minute, and titrate to the heart rate. Let's say this child had a heart rate about 110. If the heart rate comes down, we know that the blood pressure has gone up. See, we only test with the manual blood pressure cuff every 3 minutes. We do not place an arc line as a routine. So we titrate the SNP infusion to the heart rate. If the heart rate goes up from the baseline of 110, then we know the SNP infusion needs to come down because it is causing hypotension. So this is something that we have actually fine-tuned. It works beautifully. And how long? We've even gone up to SNP infusion of 5 mics, which is 5 ml per hour, which is quite high. But we do not need it for a very long time. 1 to 2 hours post the infusion, because DMSO has a metabolite which gets washed out in through the lungs. So the room has a garlicky odor after the procedure. I think that's about it. ABO incompatibility, as already mentioned, you have to prepare, watch the urine post the procedure, hydrate them well, and also give Avil, Hydrocort, etc.
So, ma'am, if you could just tell us that the SNP has a very short half-life, so it doesn't last as long.
Yes, SNP has a very short life, so that's why we prefer it to the oral antihypertensives. And SNP is pretty safe, since we have not encountered any hypotension. If you watch the heart rate and ensure there is no tachycardia, because if the heart rate goes up, you know your blood pressure is falling down, so you can even come down on the SNP infusion. We have required 1 or 2 doses of nifedipine even after the procedure, about 2-3 hours, but we've not had any long long-standing hypertension.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much. I think we have several answers for this particular slide, ma'am. I think we can move on. Okay, so now we've done PBSC, we've done cryopreservation, we've done infusion of the child as well. Now we move on to the other type of stem cell collection, which Dr. Revathi described. So Ramesh, please, could you go on?
Okay. So case number 5, we had an 8-year-old boy, a case of thalassemia major. He had a fully matched sibling who was an 18 months old girl, and the weight of the patient was 24 kg, weight of the donor was 10 kg. So bone marrow harvest was done. 150 ml of stem cells from the bone marrow were harvested from the donor, and the donor required a PRBC transfusion during the procedure.
So yeah, I think we can. Yeah. So yeah, if I could ask Venkatesh to please take us through some of the challenges during the bone marrow harvest in children, please, especially if they are babies and infants.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. So, so coming to the bone marrow harvest, so first step is actually we have to calculate how much we are going to collect from the donor. So, as ma'am said, like we can collect up to 10 ml per, minimum is 10 ml per kg of the recipient weight. However, maximum from at a particular point of time, we can go up to 20 ml per kg of the donor weight. So we have to calculate how much we are going to collect, and if the blood volume is more than 20% of the donor weight, then we have to give the blood transfusion for the child during the procedure. So it has been said that, and it has been found out that the less the age of the donor, the stem cell yield is very high, as it is seen like less than 2 years, their bone marrow cellularity is around 80%. However, 2 to 5 years, it is around 60%. And from 5 to 18 years, it is constant around like 50%. So younger the donor, the higher the yield of CD34. So in young donors, we can collect less volume, which will give an equal amount of the stem cell as it is seen in the older children. And it is also seen that bone marrow harvest has its own complication. So particularly because the volume of blood loss is very high in case of bone marrow harvest. So they can have a bleeding, or they can have hypovolemia, anemia, and it is seen that donor is to recipient weight ratio, when it is less than 0.75, it is associated with increased risk of anemia and post harvest cardiac events in the donor. So we have to keep in mind that which particular amount has to be harvested from the donor, and it has to be kept to be safe level. And it is also found that when we are collecting up to 20 ml per kg of the recipient weight, it actually it leads to over harvesting of the sibling donor. It leads to longer procedure time, longer exposure to anesthesia, and longer recovery time. So the more we are collecting, they are going to have a lot of complications. So these children can have complication related to anesthesia. They can have a bleeding from the aspiration site, hematoma, and the more we harvest, the more marrow sites will be aspirated. So they have a lot of pain. So they might require analgesia for a day or two. Then all these children, as said earlier, will require transfusion support to tackle the anemia because of the bone marrow harvest. So from our data, what we found out is like out of the 970 children, 280 children who had the related donor transplant, 70 had like bone marrow transplant, of which we have not gone and collected the stem cell we have not collected the stem cells in 2 times. So basically, even with, when the donor is 6 months or 8-month-old child, we can get enough stem cell from the donors.
Yeah, so what he meant was that, I mean, by that one bone marrow harvest itself, you do get a good yield from most of the children. Yeah, this we should know. We're all big fans of history and people who come from experience. And we have 3 people with us in our panel, Dr. Revathi and Dr. Sharanya and Dr. Indra, who come from experience. So who's this person? Yeah, I think most people have answered, ma'am. Yeah. So yeah, so this is another scenario which we can face when we do transplants. Ramesh, can you give us a brief?
Yeah, so case number 6, we had a 5-year-old girl who was a case of relapsed ALL. She had a matched and unrelated donor HSCT. So recipient blood group was O positive and donor blood group was B positive. So here there was a major blood group incompatibility.
Next, yeah. So this is another scenario. So we spoke about the cryopreservation. We spoke about harvesting. Now I request ma'am to please take us through a little bit on this topic, please.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm just going to go back to the slide and spend a minute more on this, which I went through very quickly the last time. If you don't mind, just give me a minute, because if I have the slide, then it's easier. So I said that it all depends on what antigens are there on the red cells and what antibodies are there in the plasma. And we said that there are 3 phases in the transplant: one during conditioning, and then after the stem cells are given, and then after engraftment. So the 2 weeks where their counts are low and we have to support them, and after engraftment when the donor red cells come up. So we call it major incompatibility if there are already preformed antibodies against the red cells in the plasma. So for example, this you would see if the recipient is O and the donor is either A, B or AB. So here we have to be careful and we have to remove all the red cells from the stem cells. If it's the other way around, the donor is O, then they have natural anti-A and anti-B in their plasma. So if the patient is either A or B or AB, then we have to do plasma reduction, because we have to remove the anti-A and anti-B from the plasma. Sometimes it can be bidirectional incompatibility. So the donor can be A and the recipient can be B, or vice versa. And there you have a combination of both red cell and plasma incompatibility. So there we have to remove both red cells and plasma from the stem cells. So we know that you are allowed to give 0.1 to 0.2 ml per kg of incompatible red cells. You can get away with it. But if you're going more than 0.2 ml of incompatible red cells, then you're asking for trouble. There will be hemolysis. Some units check for the anti-A, anti-B titers and then try and do plasma exchange before they do incompatible transplants. We've never done that. And we've done recently a survey of all the ABO incompatible transplants, and it didn't really affect the outcome. But what we know is if you have any blood group incompatibility, the patient is more prone to either hemolysis or pure red cell aplasia during the time of blood group change. So which is usually 30 to 60 days. So during infusion, make sure we've done good red cell and plasma reduction of the stem cells, and post procedure, support them adequately with the compatible red cells and platelets. And when the blood group is getting converted between 3rd to 6 months, we just have to make sure that they're not going in for acute hemolysis or pure red cell aplasia, both of which respond really well to steroids.
Thank you, ma'am.
So this is what I was talking. These tables are all available online, which you can look up.
So I think we have 2 quizzes, I think one after the other. Yeah, I think we can move on. Yeah. Okay, so now we move on from the patient to actually the most important person in this whole discussion, which is the donor. So we move on to 2 cases which are related to donors. Yeah, go on, Ramesh, please.
We had an 8-year-old boy who was evaluated and diagnosed to have a familial HLH perforin gene mutation, and he had CNS involvement. So he was started treatment as per the HLH 2004 protocol, and he was planned for a transplant at the earliest. The issues where the child was conceived through donor ovum, the biological mother could not be traced, and the father was only 2/10 match. So there is no option of haplo-HSCT in this scenario. So we had a 10/10 match donor from the DKMS registry. So the stem cells were transported to the transplant center, and there was a loss of cells from 11 million to 3 million, and it was needed to be cryopreserved.
So I must just mention credit to DKMS, because this was in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and they just stepped up and realized this is an important case and just came through for us. But I'd like Sharanya ma'am to please again tell us from her experience of these 3 topics, please, about the safe transport of unrelated donor stem cells, about backup donors, and yeah, viability issues as well.
Actually, we had one exciting transport of unrelated donor stem cells to Romania, which has been the only one that has gone out of the country so far. And this was in May 2019. And see, the thing that is most critical is, first of all, starting with your counts that you take. We had more than adequate. In fact, 3 times the volume of the numbers of cells that were required that actually were harvested. The child, it was for a small child, but here we had an adult. And the harvest took place in Hyderabad, and we were there, and everything went well, and we got an excellent volume, because for some strange reason they continued doing the harvest. Well, it worked out well, because the Romanian Stem Cell Institute had actually organized its own courier to collect the stem cells from Hyderabad Yashoda Hospital, which meant there was it was a really coordinated effort, because keeping the flight timing in mind, the harvest was done that morning. It was literally handed over to them at 1:30 in the afternoon. It was packed by them. They had all the packing material, dry ice, everything ready. It was straight away packed. Of course, a sample was taken for counts, which we did subsequently, which were excellent. And it was transported by them that same night on the flight, and it reached exactly a day later. And the counts were very good, even on receipt at their end. And it went in a perfect optimal condition to them. So everything went well. But things can go awfully wrong at times when we can't say, especially if you say that DKMS did this during the COVID, there could have been any disruption of the flight services. which could have caused an undue delay in the transport of the cells. And if it was not adequately packed or improperly packed, this can just about happen, because the temperature of transit is very critical. And when you're transferring such things, talking about, so this is about the unrelated donor stem cells. The temperature is critical, the cell dose is critical that is being transported, and it has to be a completely coordinated effort. Luckily for us, like I said, it was all organized by them, so it went through. But when you come to the next thing, what happens if something goes wrong? Yes, ideally you do need to have backup donors, and that's easier said than done. Because getting donors to be in a queue for us is something almost impossible for the moment for Jeevan. It probably other registries in the country might have a better experience, but it is very difficult. Most the donors agree to register as donors. We've done the HLA typing. When we actually call them, the donor attrition rate is pretty high, close to about 60%. So, it is very frustrating, but I am hoping for a day when we have 3-4 donors lined up for every request we have. And if that is going to be a reality, it would really help any patient requiring stem cells at any corner of the world. I think cryopreservation and viability I've already touched on.
Yes,
Ramya,
yes, you have. Yes. You have spoken about that. Thank you, ma'am. Again, just to add, ma'am brought out really nice points. One is the temperature at which the stem cells are transported.
And the chain of custody has to be maintained.
Yeah, exactly.
Because the chain of custody is very critical. The locking at this end and the unlocking there, the temperature being monitored both ends with continuous monitoring during transit. All this is very critical to ensure your product.
Absolutely. And about the cell dose that ma'am mentioned. And the other point is about the fact that there are no X-rays. We all know that in the airports, all of us go through the...
That permissions are got by them.
Exactly. So absolutely. So for any unrelated transplant, all this, there's a huge amount of paperwork which is done prior to getting the stem cells and getting them to your center. And one of them includes a signature which says that not to be X-rayed because these are stem cells. And just to add about the story about the previous child, that because they didn't allow for a courier person to come from Germany because of the COVID restrictions. So the pilot actually carried the stem cells in the box and they got it here. And DKMS VMST in Bangalore helped us a lot in transporting the cells. But thank you, ma'am, for bringing out those points. So temperature, cell dose, and the fact that there are no X-rays. Thank you, ma'am. And this is the last but not the least quiz point.
COVID-19 storage vessels.
I think we got those. Yeah, so this is the last scenario. Yes, Ramesh, we have another 15 to 20 minutes more. So yeah, please go on.
Yes, ma'am. We had a 6-year-old girl with thalassemia major. We had started her conditioning regimen, and she had a fully matched 1-year-old brother who was the donor. And suddenly he was brought in with PELA, and he was found to be G6P deficient with mild URTI, like he had a hemolysis setting, so and he received a PRBC transfusion also.
So this was a scary situation. This happened about, I think, almost 4.5 years ago, and the child, touchwood, is doing really well now, the child and her brother. This scenario. So this, I'd like ma'am to please take up this point and tell us about the donor emergencies.
Thank you. So these are situations we don't want to relive, because once we start the conditioning, we need to make sure that the donor will be okay to donate. And so many variables can go wrong when we are doing the harvesting simultaneously in parallel with conditioning. If you have the cells in the freezer, that's a different story. But if we are doing things in parallel, and COVID really brought home the point that, you can start the conditioning and then suddenly the donor can get COVID. So there are so many issues. So we try and counsel families very carefully as to what to do for during the donation. We try to make sure that they are aware of how important the, how important the donor is to this whole process. So we try to tell them to minimize visitors whatever we've been doing during lockdown is what the donors face during the week before the donation, so that they don't fall ill with their food and everything. We've had problems with dengue. We've had problems with respiratory infections. Sometimes both the parents are focusing on the child, so the donor is left with grandparents or aunts and uncles, and they fall ill because of that. So this was a peculiar situation, and we counseled the family about G6PD. And after the transfusion, when they saw that the baby donor was okay, they did give consent to proceeding with the harvest. But these days, with the haplo donor available, I think it's always good practice to tell families. So if you look at all the unrelated registries where we are doing without cryopreservation, they always get consent saying there could be a rare situation where the donor can back out or for some reason are not able to donate. So when I was during my training, there was a situation at that time we didn't even have haplo donors. The donor was coming to the hospital to donate the PBSC, and on the way had a road traffic accident. So the recipient, we had to quickly decide what else to do. And as I said, in those days, there was no concept of in the 90s of haplo donors as well. So these are things that are true donor emergencies, and we have to have contingency plans as to what to do for these times. So this baby, as Ramya said, had a good outcome because we just had to transfuse. It was only G6PD deficiency, but always be prepared to tell how important the donor is.
So this is the last quiz, and I must compliment everyone who've joined, all our panelists and ma'am, and everyone for sticking to time so brilliantly. We've finished before time, so we do have some time for going through the quiz questions, I think, because that will be good learning for all of us. Yeah.
You can go through the answers, Ramya, for quiz 1 to 8. I will stop sharing.
Yeah, maybe you could just go to the quiz slides, please, each of those, just for the reference. But I think most people have answered, and I wish we had some gifts or something, but we don't. Knowledge is the gift.
Virtual gifts.
Yeah. So I think most people answered. This is gene therapy.
So we have to get better and better in knowing how to do PBSCs in small children, because if gene therapy is going to be the future, we need to know a lot more about cryopreservation, mobilizing small children. So this is something that's going to be important for us for the future.
And I think for this, most people did answer AB, which was accurate as per what we had discussed. So this is MSC, which is mesenchymal stem cells. So I think because we have a minute, if anyone, ma'am or Venkatesh or anyone want to just tell a little bit about those.
So they are very overhyped cells. These are the cells that are the supporting cells in the marrow stroma. They have good anti-inflammatory properties. So mesenchymal stem cells have been used as part of GVHD therapy and in a lot of inflammatory autoimmune conditions like inflammatory bowel disease. So these are mesenchymal stem cells, which are the supporting stem cells for the hematopoietic stem cells.
And this, I think, colony forming units, which people have answered.
So that will give you a good indicator of viability. Saranya runs a cord bank, and they know that CFU is important because they make sure that the CFUs are okay to test their cryopreservation status. Yeah.
So this is E. Donald Thomas from Seattle. And HES, yes, they rightly said for the RBC
red cell reduction.
And yeah, I think this was also rightly told about liquid nitrogen tanks or vats, in which what is the temperature, ma'am, that you maintain in these?
The minus 196 degrees in the vapor phase of liquid nitrogen.
And yeah, that's right. So it's the vapor phase of the liquid nitrogen and minus 196. And in that you can ideally store for a maximum of how long?
Indefinitely, because we have to continuously refill it. Normally we have to refill it once every week almost. And it has an inbuilt gauge there. So it has to be between that 4 and 6. And so when it comes down to 4, it tells you, and so you have time to reconnect your liquid nitrogen tank to it and refill it. So, and at any time for our cord blood, we can store in each of these tanks, we store about 1,300 units.
Wow. Okay.
So
And-
that's where most of the cost of storing cord comes, because we have to constantly refill the liquid nitrogen tanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We spend about $1 lakh a month just for refilling the nitrogen every month. And, it's just going on. Like we have about 8 or 9 cylinders.
And I think one point which probably is an important point to tell is that what is the permissible amount of DMSO in the product once it is washed, so that the toxicity is reduced in the patient?
We add 50% DSO, 6 ml of that is added to each unit, which is about 24 to 25 ml of your final product. So that means your percentage works out to 10%, somewhere between 7.5 to 10%. It doesn't go over 10%.
Sure. Okay, ma'am. And I think this, I actually did not see the answers for this. I'm sorry. I think they did answer. I think I missed that. Yeah, so they said, yeah, aldehyde dehydrogenase is what everyone answered. So that's very nice. So thank you to very, very senior and experienced people for joining us today, Revati ma'am, and who coordinated most of the work for doing this and got everyone together. Sharanya ma'am, Dr. Sharanya from Jeevan, and Indra ma'am, of course, who's part of our team always and is a senior friend, really. And Venkatesh and Ramesh for joining, and of course the PHO team and Sunil Bhatt sir and Ria and everyone for giving us this opportunity. The main take-home points at the end of this discussion would be that always balance the patient and donor issues, and counseling extremely important, like ma'am said, because sometimes, of course, don't counsel that patients will run away, and don't counsel that they'll get scared, but give the facts in such a way that they understand. Nursing, of course, plays an extremely important role. Indra ma'am talked about SNP infusion, about monitoring for BP and vitals, etc. So nursing, as we all know, are the pillars, and of course, team effort, and nothing else is more important than that. And here's wishing all of you again a happy New Year and happy Pongal and Sankranti. And well, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, and this is well, everyone thought and was cribbing about why should we do a teaching session on a holiday, but I think that's the best way of starting this new year and the Pongal and Sankranti festival by doing this discussion. So thank you everyone for the opportunity.
Ramya, I'd just like to say one word, if I may. A journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step, like you said. And I hope this new year also brings in a lot more requests for cord blood. Because with COVID around, I think you'll need to think of cord blood as a better source. It's readily available. So please do think about it, because all those lovely units are being stored there.
Sure, ma'am. I mean, sure.
Yeah, okay. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ramya and ma'am, for hosting this session today. I think we have a few minutes. Am I permitted? May I ask you a question, because we have
Yes, absolutely.
here and others. Post-thaw viability and post-thaw stem cell enumeration. So what is the benchmark, ma'am, after a post-thaw, and what will be the precautions when you take for stem cell enumeration post-thaw? Because that's one of the challenges I think some of us face, in the current enumeration of stem cell numbers as well as viability after they have been thawed after cryopreservation.
You're talking to me, you're asking me, right?
Anyone can
you
probably
are
the best to answer that question.
Well, for a cord blood unit, we definitely look for at least about 70 to 80% viability. That's the only time, because and of course it's based upon our the requirement of the stem cell dose in the child. But we try to ensure that we are going to have at least about 70 to 80% viability, because only then you can be sure that you're going to be able to give adequate cells that are going to work. And now last few years, we had also started doing CFU. So if our CFU is not going to work, even if the cells are viable, it's not going to be of any use. So those two things we have to count. It's not only the cell count that is important. The CFU is the most critical.
No, I meant not only in the cord blood context, but otherwise peripheral blood stem cells, when they're stored and cryopreserved, and when you when you thaw them and then send a aliquot for testing. So there is the time duration you can have from the thaw to the analysis on a flow cytometer, for example. So those all nuances, if you could just
Yeah, so with the stem cells and DMSO, if you have, what we should understand about DMSO is, if it's inside the cell, it preserves the cell. Once it's outside the cell, it's sure to kill the cell. So as soon as we have thawed, we have to make sure that we have done the infusion within the hour. The longer we keep the DMSO hanging around with the stem cells, whatever the lab might say about the viability, we won't have that in that unit. So we have to get everything prepped and finish the infusion within the hour after thawing. And that's very important. So when we were working in Birmingham and all, the transfusion center used to do the thawing and then send it to us, and everything was coordinated beautifully so that it was all rushed in an ambulance and we are ready to receive and start and connect so that we finish within the hour. So it's important. And with the viability, what we have found is, as Saranya said, if the viability is going anything less than 70%, then the graft function is very poor later. Most of the time, you know that the stem cells have two components, the CD34, which engraft immediately, and then the CD133 that are for the long-term sustained engraftment, and they get hit quite a lot. And so long-term engraftment is not so good and you have poor graft function. So the CD34 is only a rough estimate, the viability. If it's less than 70%, then you're bound to get into trouble.
So Sunil Bhatkar, I think if I don't know, you can decide, but I think in the chat box, Dr. Satyam
wants to say something. Yeah. So Ria, can we unmute Dr. Satyan? I think
yes, anyone can unmute themselves now.
Yeah, it's a good I think point I try to raise, because it's very important when we check viabilities as well as the stem cell enumeration. It's very important to keep the lab who's going to do it ready with their controls running, and so that the time interval between the thaw and the analysis is minimized to less than half an hour probably. But otherwise you get dubious results. Some people have to take the samples and send it across to labs which are all across the city or the different state. Then you'll get a very fallacious result that may not be the representation.
We had this earlier in the CORD program, because we used to outsource CD34 and the viability had come 0%, but the child engrafted on day 4.
Correct. Yeah. So that was a practical issue which comes with post-thaw samples. Satyan, if you want to say something, Dr. Arora, please.
Thank you. And first of all, I must congratulate Dr. Revathi and team that they have actually presented a very nice seminar with good questions and a very good discussion. So I am placed in Noida. I manage a transfusion medicine department over there, and we are working with a super specialty pediatric center over there. We have done some transplants recently with decent results, and we do in-house dump freezing and we do cryopreservation. We have standardized that in our lab, and so there were a few things that I wanted just to give my inputs. One was that for a short period duration, if we need to store a unit for less than 6 months, we are able to do it using a dump freezer with -80 deep freezer. And for thawing, what we do is we store an aliquot, we store a tube segment with the bags, and we usually send that tube segment one day before we plan the transplant. So we send them in freeze form and to the lab, which we prior inform them that at what time we'll be sending the samples. And that has shown us that gives us a better time to decide at what kind of dose that we're looking at. And even doing this method, we have seen that our viability using 7-AD on flow cytometry has been somewhere around 85 to 95%. So that is something which has given us some assurance that we could continue using this in autologous cases especially. The other part was the harvest, as we typically focus less on volume of the product, more on the cycles that we do, more on the blood volume cycles that we process using the peripheral collection method. And The cycle that we target is somewhere around 3 cycles minimum that we do for a harvest. And we also look at the pre-collection peripheral PBSC, the 5-part results of the donor, and we also do one mid count of the product. So that usually gives us that which way are we heading to. So if we get a decent mononuclear cell count in our mid product, then we know that within 3 cycles we will have a decent collection. But if we know that our mid product is not giving us good counts, then we can even increase one more cycle, which doesn't usually give us good results, and or we need to plan a second harvest, or maybe we need to use Plerixafor on that day. So these were 2 things that I wanted to add, and thank you again for doing such a great seminar on this topic. Thank you.
Just wanted to add also that if you're worried that you're not having an experience center, not for you, I'm just saying in general about red cell reduction, it's better to go for PBSC in the major incompatibility, because PBSC has very minimal red cell contamination. Because if you've got the marrow and you have to do red cell reduction and not have the expertise, there can be problems.
Correct. And also there is, there's an automated red cell depletion circuits now, which can be done on the same circuits which we use.
But they need a minimum volume of 240 ml. So if you have small donors and you can't get 240 ml, then it's difficult to process them.
And I think Dr. even a nice point on that aliquot which to be stored. I think we were not doing it before. I think we had a incident, I think 3 or 4 years ago. Since then we also had a practice now to have an aliquot stored. In fact, we do a few aliquots with the stem cell source, and some are used for quality control and some are used for pre-conditioning. In fact, before conditioning, we ensure that there's adequate cell dose which is stored, and the viability is adequate.
And the dump freezing that we're doing, our DMSO percentage is somewhere around 5%. So we have published a pretty big series of 51 patients of a follow-up of 5 years when I was working in a different center. So that's the biggest dump freezing cryopreservation data which has been published from India, and now we are exclusively doing it in pediatrics. So we'll be sharing that soon.
That's good. So I think that's it probably. Thank you very much everyone for your comments, and I think thank you for also taking up this topic, because I think it's very practical and least talked about, and we all struggle in day-to-day life with these basic questions in our mind, and it was really nice to thrash it out here. Thank you very much, and happy Pongal again, and we'll see you in 2 weeks time in one of these Thursdays for the next session of our teaching. Thank you very much, and have a good evening everyone.
Thank you, sir.
And Anita and Anand for your coordination as usual. Thank you.
Thanks, Sunil. Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy New Year, yes.